Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. What happens when a man builds his dream, $1 million villa, just for the woman he loves? But what if that dream could shatter in an instant? James has everything: wealth, success, and the perfect home he built for Diep. But there's a dark cloud hanging over them. Will his love for her be enough to save her when her world starts to fall apart? In this emotional roller coaster, James is faced with a choice. Will he be able to get through this storm and prove his love to Diep? And how far will he go to fight for her, including a proposal that could change everything? Stay until the end to find out. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers. You won't want to miss what happens next. Let's get into the story. The room was heavy with the silence that followed the doctor's words. James stood by Diep's bedside, his eyes tracing the outline of her pale face. The fever had drained her of everything, leaving behind only a fragile shell. The doctor had spoken in calm, clinical terms: the fever, the redness in her eyes, the looming threat of blindness. But the words struck James like a hammer. The weight of them pressed down on him, each syllable echoing in his mind. He watched Diep's shallow breathing, each rise and fall of her chest like a fragile thread, holding her to this world. Her hand, limp and cold, lay motionless in his. James had seen her laugh, seen her smile, but now, all he could see was the raw vulnerability in her face. What if it's too late, he wondered, his mind racing. The thought gnawed at him, relentless and cruel. His gaze flickered to the window, where the soft light of the afternoon filtered through, casting long shadows across the room. The beauty of the world outside felt like a distant memory, so far removed from the quiet, aching reality of the room. He squeezed her hand tighter, as if willing her to open her eyes, to speak, to tell him that everything would be okay. But the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, counting the moments as they slipped away. The life he had worked so hard to build, the $1 million villa, the success, none of it seemed to matter now. His thoughts were consumed by her, by the woman lying before him, and the fear that clung to him like a second skin. "Please don't leave me," he thought silently, his heart aching with the weight of his love for her. James' hand hovered over the phone, his fingers trembling slightly. The urgency of the situation pressed against him, and he knew he couldn't handle it alone. He dialed his mother's number, the ringing tone feeling like an eternity between each pulse. When her voice finally answered, it was filled with concern, just as he expected. "James, dear, where are you?" His mother's voice was warm, yet tinged with worry. "You sound off. Is everything okay?" He swallowed hard before replying, his throat tight with unspoken emotions. "Mom, it's Diep. She's sick. Her fever's out of control. The doctor, he said she might lose her sight if this goes on. I don't know what to do." He paused, hearing her sigh on the other end. "Oh, James, you've got to be strong now. I'll bring the medicine and thermometer, don't you worry. Just stay by her side. You know she needs you now more than ever." James closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a shaky breath. He felt utterly powerless, his body heavy with guilt. "Thanks, Mom. Please make sure to bring some fruit too. She hasn't eaten anything, and I don't think she'll be able to for a while. I'll take care of everything. You stay with her. I'll be there soon." As he hung up, a deep silence engulfed the room again. The weight of the call lingered in the air, thick with unanswered questions. What if I'm too late? What if I can't save her? The doubt gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to falter, not now. He glanced back at Diep, still unconscious, her fragile figure looking so small against the sheets. The momentary flicker of hope he had felt when he called his mother now seemed distant. All he could do now was wait. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting an orange glow through the curtains. James sat at the edge of Diep's bed, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. The fever still clung to her, and her breath came in shallow, labored gasps. He had given her the medication the doctor prescribed, but it felt like nothing would be enough. The weight of his own thoughts pressed on him, so heavy that they almost consumed him. How did it come to this? He thought back to their happier days, the laughter they shared, the quiet moments when they had simply been together, content in each other's company. And now, here she was, fighting a battle he could barely understand. The villa he had just built, the sprawling million-dollar home he had imagined as their sanctuary, felt like an empty monument. He wandered through the grand, echoing rooms when he wasn't beside her. It was meant to be a place of happiness, of peace. But now it was just a hollow shell, filled with the ghosts of what could have been. His success, his accomplishments all seemed irrelevant in the face of this raw, aching reality. What good is a mansion if the woman you love is suffering? He wondered bitterly. James let his fingers rest on Diep's hand again, willing her to wake, to fight. He had built everything for them, for a future, but it seemed like the future was slipping through his fingers like sand. He closed his eyes, and a silent prayer escaped his lips. Please, don't leave me now. I can't face this alone. The quiet was deafening. The only sound was the soft tick of the clock, the passage of time that seemed to stretch endlessly. James stayed there, watching her, hoping that somehow, some way, she would recover. As the evening wore on, the weight of the situation became more suffocating. James sat by the window, watching the world outside, his thoughts scattered and heavy. The villa stood silently around him, its walls closing in with each passing minute. His phone buzzed, interrupting his reverie, and he quickly answered, recognizing his mother's number. James, I've been thinking, she began, her voice tentative. You told me something earlier about Diep's parents. You said there's a possibility they might still be alive? James felt his heart tighten in his chest. The parents. The revelation had hit Diep like a storm, and now it loomed over him like an unspoken truth that neither of them was ready to confront. He hadn't expected the conversation to resurface so soon. I don't know, Mom, he said softly, running a hand through his hair. Diep was always told her parents were gone, but recently someone told her they might still be alive. It's hard to believe, isn't it? His mother was silent for a moment, her concern evident. It's hard to believe, but we have to consider it. If it's true, it could explain so much. Her emotional struggles, the way she's always seemed to carry a weight around her. But James, she paused, her voice steady but serious. This could shake her even more. You have to be ready for whatever comes next. James nodded, although he knew his mother couldn't see him. Shaking her more, he thought, the idea weighing heavily on his heart. How could he protect her from something like this? How could he be the rock she needed if the past she had buried was suddenly clawing its way back into her life? "I'll be here for her, Mom," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. "We'll figure this out together." With a quiet click, the call ended, and James sat in the stillness of the room. He looked at Diep, her face still pale, her breaths shallow. The storm of emotions brewing within him mirrored the uncertainty of the situation. The unknowns felt overwhelming, yet he knew he had to be strong for her. "Whatever the truth is, I will stand by her," he made a silent vow to himself. The villa may have been empty, but his heart was full of determination to fight for Diep, no matter what the future held. James walked through the grand, empty halls of the villa, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The luxury that had once seemed so appealing now felt like an insufferable weight. Every marble floor, every polished surface, every towering window that once filled him with pride now seemed hollow, devoid of meaning. His eyes roamed the vast spaces, but there was no warmth here, no laughter, no life. The house that was meant to be a sanctuary felt like a prison. He stopped in front of the large picture window, gazing out at the sprawling garden and the city skyline beyond. The view was breathtaking, but it did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. "This should have been our dream," he thought, feeling the sharp sting of regret. He had built it for them, for Diep. It had always been a symbol of their future, of the life they would share. Yet now, as he stood in the emptiness, it felt like a reminder of his own failure. His success had built walls, but not the kind that would protect her. James turned away from the window, the weight of his thoughts pushing him forward, back toward the room where Diep lay. He had everything he thought he needed to be happy: wealth, power, a beautiful home, but none of it seemed to matter. The villa, though magnificent, could never replace the one thing he truly needed: Diep. Back in the quiet room, he sat by her side once more. She was still unconscious, her fragile form a stark contrast to the lavish surroundings. His hand gently brushed her hair back, his heart aching as he whispered, "I'm here, Diep. I'll never leave you." As he sat there, time stretched and curled around him like the very shadows of the villa. He had everything money could buy, but all he wanted was the woman lying before him, the woman he loved. "Please, wake up," he thought desperately. "Please, let me make this right." The days stretched on, and each one felt longer than the last. James was becoming a fixture in the dimly lit room where Diep lay. His world had shrunk to the confines of this space, the quiet ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the air conditioning, and the steady rise and fall of her chest. His phone sat unused on the bedside table, the buzzing notifications from his company, his employees, his life outside these walls, now completely irrelevant. The villa, his grand creation, seemed like a distant dream, its rooms cold and empty, just as he felt inside. He had given up everything for this, for her. And yet, despite his best efforts, he couldn't bring her back. His mind wandered through the corridors of his thoughts, grappling with the weight of responsibility. He had built this life for them, to offer her a world of luxury and comfort, but it seemed that luxury could do nothing to heal the wounds of her heart or stop the illness that now threatened her very existence. James took a deep breath, looking down at Diep's still form. He wondered if she could hear him, feel his presence. "Please, Diep. Please wake up," he thought. but the words felt hollow, a silent plea that echoed in the vast, empty spaces of the house. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His mother entered, carrying a tray with tea and some food. She paused, looking at James with a mixture of concern and sympathy. "James, how are you holding up?" Her voice was soft, but the question weighed heavily in the air. "I'm trying, Mom," James replied, his voice strained. I don't know what to do anymore." His mother placed the tray on the bedside table and sat down next to him. "You've done everything you can. Just be there for her. That's all she needs right now." James nodded, but a lump formed in his throat. He wasn't sure he could believe that. He wasn't sure if being there was enough anymore. The fear that had been gnawing at him from the moment Diep had fallen ill began to creep up again. What if it's too late? His gaze turned back to Diep. His heart ached with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "I'm scared, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if I lose her?" His mother reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You won't. She's strong, just like you." But James wasn't so sure. He closed his eyes, trying to gather the strength he had left. He wasn't ready to lose her. He wasn't ready to lose the love of his life. Night had settled in, and the villa was once again cloaked in silence. James sat beside Diep, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting gentle shadows across the room. He had spent the day watching over her, feeling both helpless and protective, caught between the thin line of hope and despair. He had built this house, this life, but it all felt so fragile now, as if everything could crumble away if Diep didn't wake up. The silence of the room was broken only by the occasional sound of Diep's labored breathing. Her condition seemed to improve ever so slightly, but the fear still gripped him. He wasn't sure if the small signs of recovery were enough to lift the heavy weight on his heart. What if it's just temporary? The thought lingered in his mind, relentless. James rose to his feet and stepped toward the large window, his eyes drawn to the vast expanse outside, the dark sky, the stars twinkling faintly in the distance. The world seemed so distant, so far removed from the pain and uncertainty inside this room. He had everything he thought he wanted: the villa, the success, the luxury. But none of it seemed to matter now. The house he had built was nothing without her. The future they had planned, all the dreams they had shared, felt like distant memories. His heart ached as he thought of all the times he had taken her presence for granted. Her smile, her laughter, the quiet moments they shared. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Please, Diep, don't leave me. I need you." His voice broke as he closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. In the stillness, he could feel his emotions rising, threatening to overwhelm him. But as he stood there, in the dark of the room, something inside him shifted. A quiet resolve settled within him. "I'll be here for you, no matter what." He turned back to her side, his gaze softening. "I've built everything for us," he whispered, taking her hand gently. "I'll fight for you, Diep. I won't stop." With that, he sat down again, his heart filled with quiet hope. Despite the uncertainty of the future, despite the fear, he would not leave her. He would be her strength, just as she had been his. The house, the villa, the life. It all seemed insignificant compared to the one thing he wanted most: to see her smile again, to hear her laugh, to hold her close. He closed his eyes and silently prayed. not for the riches he had accumulated, but for the one thing that mattered most, her health, her recovery and their future together.
James, một người đàn ông thành đạt, xây dựng một biệt thự triệu đô cho Diệp, người phụ nữ anh yêu và ước mơ trong một tương lai hoàn hảo cùng nhau. Tuy nhiên, Diệp mắc phải một cơn sốt cao và có nguy cơ bị mất thị lực. James rơi vào lo sợ và bất lực khi anh chăm sóc cô, suy nghĩ về những phục hồi của Diệp và quá khứ chưa được giải quyết, ám ảnh anh giữa những cái căng thẳng đó. Một tiết lộ bất ngờ về cha mẹ thất lạc của Diệp khiến tình cảm cả hai thêm phần rối ren. Diệp kiên quyết cầu nguyện cho phục hồi của Diệp và hứa sẽ luôn ở bên cô bất kỳ điều gì xảy ra.